My father was part of a family that owned land, and they were farmers in cotton picking area of Alabama, near Bessemer, Alabama. My father was encouraged to stay on the land and inherit the land and continue to work it. But he was among the younger, siblings in his family, and he just didn't want to stay on the land. He decided to become the rebel in a way and break away from the family. And first he moved into the Bessemer, Birmingham area and worked for a while in the ore mines as opposed to working in the cotton fields. After that, he heard about opportunities in southern West Virginia and the coal mines. And so he decided that he would try his luck with his young family. His wife, my mother, and their daughter, they moved to southern West Virginia. At the time I was born in West Virginia in 1945, this was the end of World War II. My parents had moved to West Virginia about 7 years ago in 1936, 37. When I was born, West Virginia continued to be regulated by the old Constitution that, for the most part, was a pretty equitable Constitution compared to other southern states, because West Virginia did not disfranchise black people. And so African Americans could vote in West Virginia, and they could send people to public office. But then the state had a regulation that no black or white child shall be educated together. They had a kind of a dual system, right? Enfranchise them, but separate them in the school system. West Virginia would subsidize, the payment of Virginians. Like we were on the border in McDowell County. That's the farthest south you can go without being in Virginia. And so as it turned out, students from Virginia who were black were closer to our all-black school than they were to the next all-black school in Virginia. And so the state paid the state of West Virginia to allow these Virginia black students to attend the West Virginia Black School. And so they did have to move out of their neighborhood in order to continue their education. They usually had some elementary schools in those areas, but when it came to high school, then they had to move on. In West Virginia, we had trade schools, so there was an option. There was this sort of college preparatory kind of curriculum for students whose families were better off and they had higher education and all of that. And then there was the vocational curriculum for families who was working class families, and most of us were working class, who were just headed to working class jobs. And there was a vocational school that was actually several miles from the high school, so that during my 10th grade year in West Virginia is when I started going to the trade school. And the way it worked is that if you were a vocational student on that track, then you would attend the regular high school, which was located in a place called Excelsior, West Virginia. And it was called Excelsior High School. And you would spend a half a day in regular curriculum, the literature, the history, the civics, all of that you would spend half a day taking those kind of courses. Then at the other half of the day, you would spend at the trade school, and you would participate in learning your trade, the selected trade that you felt that you were interested in pursuing. And there were several options. There was drafting classes for those students who felt they wanted to get into something like architecture or designing and all of that. Auto body shop class for students who wanted to major in fixing automobiles and getting training to do that. Brick masonry department is what I selected. I wanted to become a brick mason, and so I studied brick masonry for the first, couple of years. But I actually didn't expect to go into brick masonry right after high school. It was considered a possible career option, but I expected to enlist in the U.S. Air Force. That was my ambition. And part of that ambition was based upon young people that I got to know, young men who were older than I and who had also gone into brick masonry and had actually graduated from high school. I had a couple of older friends who may be, older at that time, 2 or 3 years older than me, and graduated 2 or 3. And they were in the Air Force. They would come home, share their stories with me. I wanted to go to the Air Force. And so that was my experience, with school. And of course, we went to different schools. I mean, we went to a one-room school in the elementary grades, and we had an African-American teacher. All the teachers were black, okay? And we went from 1 to 3 in a school in the town that we lived in. And the town we lived in was called Voss Creek, West Virginia. And it had a post office address as well, and sometimes we mixed it up. That was Hartwell, West Virginia. So everybody got their mail at this post office, and nobody had home delivery. The postal service delivered the mail to this post office. You had a mailbox, and you would all go to the post office when you get ready to pick up your mail. And so we lived in a part of the town that was called the Lower Camp, in this Voss Creek Lower Camp. And Voss Creek, by the way, had to do with a little creek that ran through the neighborhood, ran through the area. The Upper Camp and the Lower Camp were divided by a white community. Right in the middle of those two, there were white houses and homes that sort of separated black neighborhoods. And so there was some borderline sort of, you might say, a little bit of mixing of poor white homes and black homes, but not by much. It was pretty clear where the boundary was, where the white homes started and black homes ended. And then there was a bridge, in the Lower Camp. In order to get over to the paved highway, there was a bridge at the upper end of the Lower Camp. And so we would have to go walk up to the bridge, cross over to the paved highway, turn left, and go up to the Upper Camp. And so on the other side of the bridge, there was about maybe 4 or 5 black families that lived on that side of the creek. And then after those 4 or 5 families, then it was whites all the way up to the company store and the post office. And then after you got past the company store and the post office, then the black community took up again. And that was the Upper Camp. And then white people were spread out around to the left of the black community in that area. So that one-room school, up to the 3rd grade, we in the Lower Camp would have to walk up to the school. It wasn't that far, but at the time, young people, we thought it was a long ways. And when it was cold, it was really a long ways because we would get real cold. We would walk up there, and the students who lived in the Upper Camp were considered privileged. And they were considered, it's interesting how the social stratification works, because we were on the Lower Camp. We were considered, like poor working class in a way, even though it wasn't much by much, But we lived on the lower end, and there was this little creek that ran through the neighborhood, and then across the street was a paved highway. Our street, we didn't call it a street actually, we called it a row of houses on our side of the creek. It's where, most of us lived, and there were about 11 houses on there, not very many, right? So it's a small little community. But across the street where the paved highway was, at the end of that street was a graveyard, our graveyard, the black graveyard. And the white graveyard was sitting up on the hill or above the black graveyard. And our graveyard was right against the railroad track. There was a railroad track in Trestle that ran. And also we were in the flood zone. And we caught the floods every year when the floods came. The Lower Camp got hit pretty bad. The higher up you went into the Upper Camp, you were away from the flood zone. And by the way, in the Upper Camp, not only did you have the post office, but you had the company store. And almost all of these families were coal mining families. And so we lived in this area called the lower camp. And in the upper camp, not only was the store there and the post office, but our own Baptist church was up there. And the one-room schoolhouse was up there. And the Dewdrop Inn was up there. A family created a recreational place where black kids could go and dance and listen to the jukebox and all of that. All of that was up in the upper camp. And so if you wanted to get entertainment, educated, religion, you go to the upper camp. Your mail, your food, everything. And so that was our lives. All of these were coal mining families. I don't think that there were any men who did not work in the coal mine. The way the coal companies worked, you would get company houses, and you had to work in the mines to occupy those homes. In West Virginia, black women, almost no black women worked outside the home. I mean, they were all in the home because the companies, they required people to be working in the mines if they were going to live in those homes. And so, just for example, when my father, passed, my mother couldn't hang on to those, to the houses anyway, because they would require that there's a male, working in the home. And so we, in a way, had to move eventually, because they didn't see us as a profitable family once our father passed away and the breadwinner was no longer in the mine. And so what you get is an ironic twist on the West Virginia's, what you might call single black family, phenomenon. Almost all of these families were male and female headed families, even during the early 20th century, late 19th century, because there were so few opportunities for women to gain household work, because the social structure of the mine and the occupational structure of the mine, they had very few top-level, white-collar jobs. If you were a white-collar worker among whites, you were either working in the company store, the post office, and there were some professional offices like doctor's office and some legal, offices. That was about it. And black ministers, even they had to work in the mines, so they double, as both miners and ministers. The racial environment was, pretty clear that we were not in an equitable environment. And then to back up just a little bit, the racial climate could be pretty hostile. And it's not like lynching didn't occur. There were a couple of lynchings even in the period that I studied, during the 1920s, of black men in that region, in some of the counties, Logan County in particular. And then that whole mentality of racism was there. And growing up, the impact of racism on young people was pretty great, because in my own experience as a child, my family teaching us how to stand up for our rights and to know when something was wrong and all of that. And I know one episode in which, as a child, I must have been about 10 or 11 years old, maybe even 9 or 10. And there was there were some white people who ran certain kinds of stores that black people would go to, besides the company store. And this was a little store in a place called Canebrake, West Virginia. And the kids would go in there and buy candy and all of that on a regular basis, And I know one incident, a group of us went in there and we bought some candy, and he put the candy on the counter, and I told him to put it in a bag. And he said, "You're not going to get a bag." I said, "Put it in a bag." You know, I insisted. I bought it. You can put it in a bag. And he reached into one of these Prince Edwards. I don't know if you know what Prince Edwards cigar boxes. Pulled out a pistol, put it in my face, and said, "You're not getting a bag." And of course, at that point, as a 9 or 10-year-old, I'm backing off. And I want to say, you know, look, I'm not going to get shot over this bag. But when I told my mother, it was upset her to no end, but she insisted that I not tell my father, not right away, because he would go down there and confront him and may have to kill him. And so she wanted me to keep it quiet for a while, because he was not going to take, you know, that kind of behavior. And so, you know, and that's not the only incident that I experienced in West Virginia. I experienced with two of my friends, young friends, a near lynching, we called it, because we were picking blackberries in a field that was owned by white folks, or at least they thought they owned the top of the hill, you know. So we were picking blackberries, and they were hauling up there telling us to get out of there. And you know, the nigger word was everywhere in West Virginia, you know. And my friend, a boy named James Moss, and he had a brother named Richard Moss, and the three of us were picking. And the white guys were calling up and talking about get out of it. And James Moss was one of these, you know, Nat Turner types. And he said, "We're not getting out of this hill, and if you don't like it, meet us on top of the hill." And so he challenged them to meet us on top of the hill. I was saying, Richard and I were saying, "Man, we don't want to meet a whole mob of white folk on top of the hill." But he insisted, and so we went to the top of the hill. We came down, we had our bucket. And we were telling James Moss that maybe we should go home. And before long, a mob, maybe 15 white guys with ropes. We had to run. James Moss didn't run right away. Up on top of that hill, you know, we could see him at the top of the hill, but we couldn't see, you know, after we said we got to run, and Richard and I, we ran, right? And then he stayed on top of the hill, and he had set up a pile of rocks, and he was throwing rocks at those guys left and right. I know he heard some of them. Pretty soon we saw him running, so we knew we were in trouble.
Hey, get over here! Yeah, I'm talking to you, boy. Your name on it. Hit me with that rock, boy. Put that rock down. You're gonna hit me.
They got close to him. Richard and I were in front, and he didn't want us to get him big because he was kind of a protector. You know, we were the younger, and he had one rock left. And this white guy was trying to reach him with that rope. And he just held that rock and said, "No, no." And pretty soon they backed off, and we went home. And you know, and this is in West Virginia, so-called liberal, more liberal than other places, but you could still get lynched, you know, so those near lynchings could be real. So that sensibility, it got my attention, you know, in terms of navigating the environment. But also in West Virginia, the determination to fight that kind of racism was pretty much instilled in us. People liked the idea that they could vote in West Virginia. That became a motivation that reinforced the economic motivation in the southern West Virginia coal fields. And the other part of the West Virginia environment is that African Americans in West Virginia were part of a Jim Crow system, no doubt about it. The schools made it so, but it was a sort of mixed system when you had voting rights. It wasn't that they just could vote, they did vote, you know, and they did place their numbers in public office. So that heyday of West Virginia was a dynamic heyday. because they were also able to create institutions that were broad-ranging across a variety of categories. And the institutions were not just their internal churches, fraternal orders, social clubs, and businesses, barbershops, beauty shops, funeral homes, some real estate, efforts. They were also able to get the state to establish some pretty powerful and helpful state-supported institutions, including an organization called the Bureau of Negro Welfare and Statistics. And this was an organization that was created on the model of statistics for immigrants, white immigrants. This bureau had a black director and was funded by the state. And it studied the African American experience, the status of blacks in jobs, a tremendous hierarchy of jobs that blacks occupied on a regular basis. Every year they would create these statistics on education among blacks, on medical care, on all kinds of different segments of their lives. In the end, those statistics were also used by black political leaders. One of the interesting things that I don't think we pay enough attention to in the research and writing we do on the synthesis of black life in the Jim Crow era is that by 2021, there were 3 black legislators in the State House in West Virginia. This was at a time when Southern blacks were being pushed out of the political arena left and right, and yet we don't sort of make that part of our story when we talk about the disfranchisement of black people in the United States, so that we can nuance that story by acknowledging these 3 legislators, but then at other times it was 1 or 2, all the way into the 30s, And so those legislators were able to, because the Republican Party depended on black votes, and in McDowell County, where I grew up, at that time, we were the heart of the black community. That was the largest concentration of blacks in the state. And we were able to parlay those votes to get these Republicans elected to the State House and to senatorial and governorships. And then these black political figures insisted on some concession. And so eventually, they were able to not only get that Bureau of Negro Welfare and Statistics, they were able to get all black homes for the elderly, a home for the blind. They had homes for different segments, of the black population. I think that one of the things that I think was most significant about their role is that they got the state to fund 2, maybe even 3 black colleges, but 2 of them, West Virginia State College, is near Huntington, right in that area. Institute, that's the name of this. The city is Institute. The West Virginia State College was in Institute. And then there was Bluefield State College in Bluefield, West Virginia. And coal mining families sent their children to these 2 black colleges. And they were formed as a result of black people mobilizing politically and putting pressure on the state to make education available to black people. The other 3rd college was Storer College near Harper's Ferry, somewhere in that area. And for a while, that was an important institution for black people. So that was the dynamic West Virginia that black migrants understood and were moving into this area. And the racial climate, the level of racial hostility against blacks was another factor. And these black legislators, they were able to, in the 1920s, early 20s, they were able to pass an anti-lynching bill. I mean, I think it's probably the only one that I haven't found any other state that at least the established literature talk about passing an anti-lynching bill where it was illegal to lynch a black person, and if you did, you had to pay. They had a modest penalty, but it was still a penalty, you know, that if the family lost a family member through the mob lynching, the family would have to be compensated for that loss. And so, so there is something about that. And then when we look at, the former statistics on lynchings, West Virginia had one of the lowest rates of lynching of black people of any state. And so, we can't discount that, better jobs, better racial climate, somewhat better access to education, political enfranchisement. West Virginia in the heyday for black people, in the heyday of black West Virginia, that is the institutional structure, that they could participate in. This moment from roughly the 1890s to the end of World War II, that was sort of, in the way I interpret it in the research I've done, that was sort of the heyday of the black community in southern West Virginia. The coal miners in West Virginia, compared to other coal mining areas, they were able to make money on par, almost on par with their white counterparts. If they were doing the same work, they got close to the same pay. There was no official job ceiling for blacks and whites. And also the mines, as bad as it may have been, they saw more cash relatively in the mining area than they did in the cotton picking area. But it was not a total break, because the company used script books, where they would issue these men script books where they could go to the post office, they could purchase items on the script, and then the company would extract the cost of those items from their check. But they still saw that they were moving a step up into a better life in the coal fields. And so by the time I was born and we grew up in West Virginia as children in the late 40s, 50s, and to some extent the early 60s, but my family moved by 1961. That was a down skid. The West Virginia that I knew and the children in my family knew was not the West Virginia that my father had hoped to join. I grew up in a West Virginia in which the consciousness of being black in Appalachia was at the low ebb. It was a low moment in the black experience. During the 1950s, when I, as a child started to grow up and understand the life we were living, coal mining and coal mining employment was very sporadic. Lots of unemployment among the miners. Everybody was predicting in some ways that the mining industry was not going to provide a future for their children. And coal mining families almost uniformly were asking their children to prepare themselves to move out of the coal fields because the opportunities were not there, and that they had to place a premium on getting a better education so that they could move up into a better life. That was the West Virginia that I grew up in. And when we were in West Virginia during the 50s, before my father passed, it was becoming apparent that not only were these men not working regularly but they were barely making ends meet. My father had started to work part-time in the lumber industry in order to piece together a living, for his family. At the end of World War II, it was pretty much a boom period during World War II because men were working, they were making good money, and shortly after World War II, it started to dissipate, but it was still pretty vibrant for a moment or two. And my father and mother, they had talked about buying a house someplace, get out of the company-owned home and move into a house. My father persuaded my mother to believe that if he bought a pickup truck, and he bought a brand new Dodge pickup truck, 1948 I believe it was, but he had to work hard to get my mother on board with that because she was determined, they had saved some money. They were ready to do something different and mainly buy a home somewhere for the family. But he convinced her that if he had a pickup truck combined with coal mining, he could do hauling and other kinds of work, including collecting scrap iron and selling, like just scavenging, and that he could pay for the truck and build a better life. So she bought on to it. But it seemed like as soon as they bought that truck, the income from mining dissipated, and the scrap iron business and all of that wasn't sufficient. And so the family suffered. And my mother often felt that, and it would have suffered anyway because they had bought a home with the loss of employment. So that was a terrible life, right there. And then, of course, families started to have to depend on government subsidies, commodities, as they would say. So my family, we subsisted on a good deal of cheese and powdered milk and all of those kinds of food. But at the time when you were in a bad way and you get some supplements, it represents, a benefit that you could appreciate. For my family, we left before our area was mandated to integrate. So we didn't have to go through the process of adjusting to moving into a predominantly white school. And for my family and our experiences, we didn't have to see the, sort of the firing and getting rid of black teachers and the impact that had. We didn't have to see the dismantling of the black sports teams, the football, the basketball, and the way in which they, decimated, the community. That came after us. But I have participated in projects where we interviewed and talked to people who were part of that process in my area. And I wanted to get back to use of the term rural communities, because in West Virginia, we consider it rural industrial community. And that is not entirely rural, it's not really urban, but it's not really, but it is industrial in the sense that coal mining was different from cotton picking or any other rural tobacco, rice, farming, sugar and so on. So I like to make the distinction that where we lived and in the coal fields, where the coal mining industry dominated, that we were in a rural industrial setting. And many of the ideals that were embedded in the rural industrial setting resemble some of the urban dimensions of life. There were people who worked in the coal mines who were really trying to get away from the farm. And they were determined that coal mining was a step up in the hierarchy. And my father was one of them. And then there were a lot of blacks who saw coal mining as a forward into a, quote, more modern, economic, upwardly mobile system. And they took pride in being able to say, that they were working in an environment where the machine was very prominent, in their lives. They were coal loaders, and there was a traditional coal loading kind of enterprise, and then there was the new, more technologically oriented, coal mining. And so, yeah, so I'd make a distinction there. It's not like some of these communities were definitely situated in a place where they could do some significant farming, maybe. But in West Virginia, farming was minimal because the land was so, mountainous and rocky and all of that. But even so, gardens were everywhere. It didn't matter where you live, you're going to carve out a space to grow some corn, greens, potatoes, onion, peppers, and so yeah, so that rural part, these people who were migrating to West Virginia, for example, they were all very much into maintaining a hog or two. Every year, you would fatten up a hog, kill it during season, and have meat over the winter. Build smoke houses, smoke that meat, and so yeah, so it's that sort of mix of industrial, not quite urban, but not altogether rural. We moved to a place called Newcomerstown, Ohio, which is just south of Massillon and Canton, in sort of northeastern Ohio. And small town, no more than about 3,000 people, and about 2 streets on which African Americans live. And our family was the biggest family in town. There was another family that moved in after us that had almost as many as we did, but we were the largest family, and it was an environment in which we were told, well, first of all, this is a classical case. My mother wanted us to move for a number of reasons, to get out of West Virginia, have a better life economically and so on. But also, I had a brother who had congenital heart disease. But my mother was motivated to move partly because my brother's health condition was untenable. If we stayed in West Virginia, he would likely have passed. He would like to have died because he needed to get some emergency medical treatment. And so part of the motivation for moving was to gain greater access to, health care for my brother. And as soon as we got to Ohio, one of the first things my mother did was to get him diagnosed and into a hospital. And it was just in the nick of time because he had an open heart surgery in Children's Hospital in Columbus, Ohio, and saved his life. And since that time, he's had recurring surgeries over a lifetime, but he has done pretty well as a man and as a person who eventually gained strength and was able to have a career, go to Central State College and get a degree and become a special education teacher and so on, and to eventually write his memoir about his health struggles. In Newcomerstown, there was no vocational school. We had a shop, carpentry shop, where we were taught woodworking. And I participated in that, but I had to go to the regular curriculum, which ended up being what they call, I guess, a general curriculum. And I took more academic courses, and I was able to do pretty well. And eventually, I was able to do well enough to get into college. But initially, that wasn't my aim. And I probably would not have gone to college had the Air Force recruiting station been open on the day that my mother allowed me to take off from school to go and enlist in the Air Force. I was in high school getting ready to graduate. I wanted to leave the day after I graduated. I didn't want to stay a minute longer. And it was closed. And because I was in a class that was taught by the coach, the football coach, he asked me why was I absent. I never missed class. And I told him I was at the Air Force recruiting station. My mother, it was a ways away from Newcomer Sound, a place called New Philadelphia. So we had to drive. My mother got somebody to drive us. He told me in no uncertain term, you shouldn't go to the military. You should go to college. Because he knew I was doing well. I was honor roll student and so on. Something I didn't do in West Virginia, by the way. I was a sort of a businessman in West Virginia, taking off on Mondays to do my business accounting and all of that. And so I didn't get the kind of grades that I would get in Ohio. But then my mother, when I told her about that, she encouraged me by saying that I had an aunt in Evanston, Illinois, and there's a big college there. You know, she was talking about Northwestern, but a big college, expensive college, and she said she would write my aunt to see if I could live with her while I tried to put myself through school. My aunt accepted it, and I went to Evanston, but not to Northwestern. I got a job at Northwestern in the cafeteria, and then I enrolled in a junior college on the edge of the Northwestern campus, and that's the way I got my leg up into the academia. While I was in junior college, there was a recruiter for a college in Kenosha, Wisconsin, called Carthage College. And they offered me a scholarship and support for a 4-year degree. And I said, you know, I didn't even consider applying anywhere else. When they did that, I didn't even apply for any more 4-year schools. I just went straight to Carthage and got a degree teaching, you know, history, and then got a job teaching in high school in the city of Kenosha and stayed there 6 years. And my wife, LaRue, and I, she was a student at Carthage, and we met there, and we got married just the day before she graduated. So her name is Trotter on her graduation certificate. And then both of us worked for 6 years. Well, I worked for 6 years there. She worked for 4 because she graduated 2 years after I did. And then we went to Minnesota. For me now, where my research is headed, as I near the upper levels of my career, I am thinking about how do we continue to connect our scholarship, our research, and our writing to the liberation struggle, the resistance to inequality struggle, to the social justice movement. When I look back over it, you know, we've talked a lot over the years about the foundational research on the black community was done in the 19th century. 19th century pioneers, they were primarily ministers or very religious, committed people who wanted to really craft a history based on biblical sort of orientation, but harnessed to the liberation of enslaved black people. That 19th century liberation scholarship is about eliminating slavery, an abolitionist kind of scholarship. And then when we get to the Jim Crow era, Du Bois, Woodson, all of those people were about a new scientific scholarship anchored to the mission of demolishing Jim Crow and resisting the expansion of Jim Crow. And so our scholarship has been liberatory all along. And even when we go into the civil rights era, liberatory. And then you start getting these permutations, right? When I started working on Workers on Arrival, I think that at that moment, we were in a kind of, let's put it this way, reparations has always been, in my mind, a kind of implicit part of the meaning of the scholarship that we produce. Then this diversity, equity, and inclusion sort of inserted another kind of frame around a lot of what we were doing. But pretty soon, reparations over the last few years has taken off, right? And so I find myself now working very hard to reinforce that reparative justice movement, and that the work that we do should be in part about making the case, for not just removing the barriers, but for fixing the past, with some real tangible material investments in our community. And now we're fighting a rear guard action because they're trying to dismiss or dismantle what was designed to eliminate the barriers, right? So we got to fight that battle all over. But I'm wrestling with this. I'm trying to, and I know that the reparatory justice part is very front and center of what I'm doing now.